Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me introduce our panel of presenters for you today, our discussion panel. Earlier this morning, we talked about how housing policies and programs can be an integrating human factor to try to deal with poverty. This session will look at how we can create shared value and provide a new partnership architecture to address not just the physical housing infrastructure needs, but also to help create sustainable communities that have access to jobs, basic and essential services, and create an environment that fosters innovation. This is the one that I actually really love. We live at a time that is extremely disruptive. Technology is coming in. There are new services, new ways of doing things. Can the private sector find ways to actually help in this? This session will shed light on the need to stimulate a pioneering approach to community development. With the help of the private sector, we all know the private sector contributes to 80–90% of development as a key element of national strategies to help communities help themselves create economically strong, environmentally sustainable, and inclusive communities. Let's answer the question we will try to focus on now is, how can the private sector help foster innovation toward building healthier, more inclusive communities that have access to and create opportunities for themselves? Joining us in this session are, in the middle, Mr. Fernando Zobel de Ayala. He's chairman of Ayala Land Incorporated and president and chief operating officer of Ayala Corporation. Ms. Kimberly Elgin-Wolf, the Senior Vice President for Resource Development of Habitat for Humanity International. Dr. Rodel D. Lasco, the Scientific Director of the Oscar M. Lopez Center for Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Management Foundation, Inc., part of a team that won a Nobel Prize. Dr. Sujata S. Govada, Trustee of the Urban Land Institute from Hong Kong, and Asharan K. Agarwala, the Director of Aditya Birla Group from India. Before we start our discussions, let me ask everyone, perhaps starting with Mr. Agarwala at the end, and let's go down this way, to just give us an idea of what you're working on today, what is important for you, and how do you see the private sector playing a role?
Well, the real example of partnership of playing the role of private sector for the development of community, for the development of society, to play the role of CSR, is this forum itself. How many people have sponsored this forum? And the forum specifically emphasizing the need of affordable houses for the people who don't have the roof. So to provide the roof to the roofless people, it is the greatest forum, and that is the greatest sponsorship by private sector, who can join hands with public sector, that's the government, maybe with the NGOs, and with the community itself. For any inclusive growth, all the three have to play their role. You need the public sector by way of the government permissions, the availability of land, the area where the community is required, providing infrastructure, maybe road, maybe water connections, maybe sanitation. Private sector has to play its role in creating those facilities, in helping those facilities, creating availability of the funds, and bringing the, trying to identify which one is the community who really needs it. Our founder father, Mr. G.D. Birla, who was the very close associate of Mahatma Gandhi, he developed the concept of trusteeship, that corporates, business are not only for their own benefit, but for the larger benefit of the society. They are basically trustees of the public, of the investors, of the shareholders, and of the public in large. So with that concept, we have been working all the way. The greatest example I will give is about 15 years back, Habitat people came to me. That was the first time I came to know about the Habitat. And I built 120 houses in a remote place in UP, where I created a new set of financing, 1/3 by the beneficiary, 1/3 by our organization, and 1/3 by Habitat. We gave at one-time donation, beneficiary gave by way of the labor, and Habitat one-third contributed, which of course they are realizing with a very marginal addition of inflation or something like that. In other words, Habitat got the advantage of getting their funds back, beneficiary got the house, and for us it was a CSR activity. What we have been doing is that ultimately CSR should be the responsibility and acceptability by the community, responsibility of the organizations. Now the CSR word has come. In the morning some of my friends said that what is CSR now in India? Perhaps Government of India has recently passed a law in which large corporates, after certain amount, they have to compulsorily contribute 2% of their profits for CSR activities. And CSR activities have to be mainly in the larger interest of the community. It may be project based, it may be in any other manner, but with the objective of the organizations. What we have been doing is to take care of the community where we are present. For example, if we have our aluminum plant, which is almost about 100 miles from the nearest railway station, about 300 miles from the nearest airport, we build the plant where we try to provide house to everybody, not only to the workers who are working with us, but also to the community people. We gave all the sanitary facilities to them, water supply to them, electricity to them, created schools for them, created hospital for them. We tried to give all sort of facilities which can be made available to a particular community in a particular town or in a particular village. So these can be termed as the donation, this can be termed as the charity, this can be termed as CSR, but ultimate motive is what? Is to ensure that community gets the benefit. When we are operating with the community, society gives us so much, community gives us so much. It is our earnest duty. It is our ensure that we give back to the society. And how do we give that? That we can do only by this kind of CSR activity. And for this, as we said earlier, we need the NGOs. Habitat for Humanity is the best example. We need the private sector to fund it and to initiate the activity. We need the political support, we need the government support to get government land permission, to get the environmental permission, to ensure that the emission is within the limits available, to provide some kind of public health like maybe main roads or maybe rail stations or etc. etc. And largest than that is community itself. We have to empower the community. They should not think that these are the charitable things which everybody should enjoy freely. Community themselves have to have their mental setup. That they should not live, they should not depend on charity, they should not depend on CSR only. They must do on their own. We should make them self-depending. For that, we have to create jobs, we have to create important things for them by which they can earn their own livelihood. We can develop facilities for them, maybe vocational trainings, maybe training in the workshops, try to give them small-scale industry which can be feeder for the large industry, big industry. They can help in the transportation, they can help in the supply of the labor, they can help in many manners. So what I want to convey is that private-public partnership together with the NGOs, together with community can really be a real model of model village. You adopt a village, create all facility, leave that village to the panchayat or to the community, move to another village. But keep an eye in 2 years, 3 years, whether they are working in appropriate manner, they are progressing as it was designed. That is what I feel. CSR should be there. That is how private, public sector, joint inclusive growth can take place by this kind of model. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move to Ms. Wolf. Mr. Agarwal talked about the collaboration of NGOs from an international NGO's perspective. What are you working on now?
I think really there's been a huge shift in the relationship that NGOs have, particularly with our corporate partners. And I think it's become very incumbent upon us to identify the intersection between housing needs, our societal needs, and corporate business plans. I think gone are the days of traditional corporate philanthropy, and here are the days where we partner together. And I think when we talk about shared value partnerships, that can mean anything from looking at markets and products in a different way. It can mean looking at the productivity of value chain models and how we can contribute. And then when we look at community development, as Mr. Agarwala just spoke of, we need to think about not just our societal need and what the NGO is focused on in those that we serve, but those that we serve, the poorest of the poor, represent a huge consumer marketplace. And I think the connect between who we serve and corporate business strategies is really imperative.
Interesting. We'll move on to Dr. Sujata.
Yeah, I'm here to represent the Urban Land Institute, and professionally I'm an urban designer planner as well, founded and managing UDP International, and we try to actually be working on very sustainable and community-oriented projects, so there's a lot of public engagement, design, and everything involved. And I wanted to share what we did in Manila with Metro Manila with ULI, which actually the project ended up bringing Urban Land Institute to Philippines, and which I'm actually very happy that happened that way. And the work we did was over the last 1 year, what you see on the screen, the 10 principles for sustainable development of Metro Manila's new urban core. Because obviously Metro Manila itself is huge, and I think even if you have to start with something, principles to a smaller area as a model, get it right, and I think with Metro Manila being the center for Philippines itself, then it could be a model for the rest of Philippines itself. And the process as well as the way the principles were achieved were actually very collaborative with the private sector, some of the government sector, the community, academia involved. And I would think even launching a study like this, I would look at it as CSR on the part of the sponsors, because at the end of the day, what they're looking for is how can Metro Manila be developed in a more sustainable manner in the future. And I'm glad to say that out of the 10 principles, I think about half of them relate to sustainable communities and housing. Just want to give me 1 minute to say what these are. I'll elaborate these in the presentation tomorrow, but basically the first one is create one Metro Manila with a common goal and common vision. And I think that's very important, because what we saw was there's a lack of it. And there are so many different cities within, everybody has their own views. And I think that was the first thing that came out. Improving urban mobility, because you go out, you see a lot of traffic congestion and everything. Integrated transport and infrastructure was key, that is looking at the flooding, drainage, and everything. Then the third one was making beautiful places, using the concept of business improvement districts and high quality public space, which like companies like Ayala, you've done a lot to actually make sure that happens in Manila, which being from India, I was quite impressed that, India needs to learn a little bit more from Philippines as well. The next one was working together. That's on the theme of collaborations and partnerships. Building those PPP partnerships we talked about, bringing people in. I think that was clear. Then the other thing was establishing good governance, and which is a streamlined regulatory framework and effective development control. And I'm glad to hear that the current government has the commitment and the political will to make sure that this happens. The next one was engaging everyone, so an inclusive, participatory, and transparent process, which is important. The next principle was empowering people and using the concept of community improvement districts following the business improvement district model, but actually looking at how these poor communities can actually be create a livelihood for them with education, awareness, and employment opportunities. Then be prepared is disaster preparedness and resilience, which a lot of people talked about. Then restoring human dignity. And I think it clearly spells out affordable housing and actually delivery, policy as well as delivery of housing as key. And the last principle was go beyond smart communities. In other words, not just technology, smart in terms of where you locate the communities, but also look at creating more livable, sustainable, and walkable communities. And I think these were the principles, and I just want to add, where the private sector can take a role is leading by example. And I think like the Aditya Birla Group, the Ayala Group, it's actually, there are companies that are doing it, and I think people need to become role models for other companies to follow suit, and some of that might happen, maybe what you said, sir, about India saying mandatory to some large companies, but maybe the other way is also commending people and companies that actually take the charge and the leadership and then get other people in the same spirit. So it doesn't become discussed as CSR, but it's actually normal, and you cannot do without that kind of an attitude. And then the other thing is also have targets and see how you get to those targets. You can actually measure as you go, so that it's quite clear what kind of progress has been made and what more we need to do. Like in spite of what all we've done, we still are just touching the surface. There's a lot more to do. How do you achieve that? I think that would be important.
Thank you. Let's move to Mr. Ayala.
Maria, in my case, I've been involved in the in real estate development in the private sector for a long time. I've also been involved with Habitat for Humanity for over 10 years. And the reason I got involved in Habitat for Humanity is that they were working with a group of people that was not being helped by the regular market forces. That has actually changed in the Philippines. With good governance, a much better economy, interest rates have come down, and as a result of that, the market itself is helping solve some of the housing problems of the country, and that's very powerful. I've always felt that CSR alone cannot solve the housing problem. There are many parts of it where CSR can help, but it cannot solve the big problem. And I think we all understand that we cannot live or be in progressive societies if there are still so many people living in poverty. I think we also appreciate and agree that housing is at the core of breaking the poverty cycle. If you can't give them a roof, they can't really get started in life and become a productive member of a community. So I think in the private sector, we're all looking for scale, and we're looking for ways of helping each other, government, private sector, NGO community, to find these solutions to produce scale and finally solve this problem of housing.
Fantastic. And finally, Dr. Riddell.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm coming from the science community, and my work is on climate change. And if you have been following the whole climate change, global warming issue, you know that just last week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did release the report showing that the planet is indeed warming. Now, that has a lot of relevance to the issue of housing, especially for our poorest of the poor, the informal settlers. If I remember my figures right, there are about 1 billion people who are informal settlers, and these are the most vulnerable to climate change. And so you have all sorts of problems associated with informal settlers and poverty, and overlay climate change or global warming, and you can imagine how it will be much, much worse for them. And so our center, the OML Center, is born out of the concern of the Lopez Group of companies to make the Filipino society more resilient to climate change, climate risks, as well as disasters. And so what we're trying to do is we're a science-based center. We do research. One, we provide grants to the top universities of this country, as well as the researchers. They need a lot of support because climate change is a science issue. It started from, of course, science and technology, fossil fuels, and so on, which are good. I mean, we are enjoying the fruits of science and technology. But as a result of that, we do reap the bad side of science, which is, of course, fossil fuel emissions, and so on. And so what we're trying to do is support scientists through grants. At the same time, we conduct our own in-house research in trying to find out, for example, how we can lessen the vulnerability of the poorest of the poor, including the informal settlers, to climate change. So we are, in a way, breaking new ground in the sense that, as far as I know, this is the first time that there's a significant investment by the private sector to finance research, especially climate research in this country. And we also hope to become one of the leading centers, perhaps in the developing world as well, in addressing the problem of climate change, and especially as it relates to the most vulnerable sectors of our society. So let me end there, Maria.
Fantastic. Let me pick up several threads that you all talked about. I mean, one of the interesting things you all talked about, collaboration. It's certainly not something that private sector can do alone. Yes, in yesterday's high-level dialogue, it struck me how to try to solve this housing problem, you actually need government leadership. And Fernando, you brought up free market forces, government leadership, so it seems to be finding that. And then this, between CSR and businesses finding, seems to be enlightened self-interest. It's to everyone's interest to do that. What happens when you have different levels of government leadership? Like in yesterday, we found Singapore, where government took a very strong position and made housing the centerpiece of its governance. South Korea had a housing guarantee, 60% government funded, and then you had the United States where you had very little, a lot driven by market forces. What happens, what can private sector and the NGO do when there isn't a clear path for a government? Can you do anything? Please, Sujata.
Yeah. I think if you take the example of Hong Kong, where we've been there for 20 years, what we find more and more is actually the community is actually through their aspirations, because after 97, Hong Kong is looked upon as a city of their own, right, not a borrowed place. Community is very much more vocal. And we can see that actually the city government is looking at global visions, whereas the people are looking at local aspirations. And what we find over the last 10 years is actually these are converging. And it's coming to be like more a shared vision for the community. And especially if you look at like Harbourfront in Hong Kong, that is a big thing, because housing is Hong Kong did not solve the problem similar to Singapore, because Singapore did it more on public housing ownership, whereas Hong Kong chose the route of rental. Yes. But public rental with some ownership, but the public rental is very much at if the commercial rates, they're giving at 10%. To the people who are really the needy. So I think they've addressed in their own way the housing situation, but you might say the amount of area that people get is much lower than what Singapore does. But I think it's very important, and even if you look at any other country or any other cities in the West, or you find actually the community has a role to play.
Yes.
And I think people need to realize that. It's corporate, the NGOs like Habitat for Humanity, but also the general public. And in Hong Kong, we can see that through the efforts government is at a mode like, they're listening to the community, but soon I think it will next go into the mode of being more proactive.
So,
And it becomes like something that they want to do it. And I think that's where it needs to go. So I really would encourage the community to actually be actively involved in the process and look at people not as a problem, but more as an opportunity. If you look at it that way, then imagine all that lost opportunity of all the people below the poverty line or even in the lower level is you're not able to use that opportunity there is. So looking at it as a positive,
okay.
you become more clear that you really want to address it.
So you're saying even despite, without government taking the clear initiative, it can go bottom up. I mean, Fernando, in the Philippines, the government's approach is bottom up, right? It has these 5 pillars, and yet it's not quite as coherent as other countries around the world. I'll come to you next, Kim. But in your case, what are the problems that the private sector has had to deal with? What would you like to see solved?
I think we're making progress. I like to be, I'm generally an optimist, Maria, and I've seen enormous progress under this administration. So I mentioned earlier that market forces are taking care of part of the problem on their own, so I'm now looking at the other aspect, the aspect that Habitat's involved in. And one thing that's very dramatically different from what I've seen in the past is government trusts the NGO community. We've had a series of scandals, unfortunately, in the Philippines on another part of the NGO community, and I certainly wouldn't want that to destroy the legitimate members of the community who have been around for a very long time and have been working very hard for this country. And so we have to be careful about that. But certainly Habitat is one of the greatest NGOs I've ever worked with, and that's why I've been involved for more than 10 years. And what's happening there, we had the issue in Cagayan de Oro, just as an example. Sure. When there's trust and there's collaboration. Government is really the first on the ground, and they're expected to react immediately and produce immediately. They have an enormous amount of red tape that they have to go through. Whereas an NGO that's properly organized, that's ready to move, can figure out their costs much more quickly. In that particular case, thanks to Charlie Iko and a whole great team that he had down there, we were actually able to build 1,000 houses within 100 days, which I have never seen before, even in the private sector, frankly. And that's what collaboration with the government can do. Secretary Soliman Dinky this morning was saying that Habitat had been used to go into the ARMM, the autonomous region of Mindanao, that most people don't go into. And again, we could work with government. They had the resources, they needed people to go in. So what I'm saying, Maria, if that trust can continue to be built, and if we could have more people involved in that sector, I think there's so much more that we can do. There's a second part that I just wanted to mention, which I know that we're discussing in breakouts and in some of the conferences, which is that there's so much more that needs to be done than just housing. Yes. You can't just take a person that has been living under a bridge all their life, put a roof on them and say, this is now a member of the community. It's just the beginning.
Yes.
And so there are so many ancillary elements that are really very tough to build. The water systems, the health, the education, the values formation, there are just so many elements. I don't think government can go into each location and try and do this. This really is the responsibility of individuals and companies near that location that want to produce and uplift, I guess, the members of that community. This is actually, at the end of the day, it's self-interest, as you mentioned. Yes. This is the workforce that will come to you. This is security. This is goodwill. And so if each of the private sector entities or players in a particular area could take responsibility, they are the ones that can help out with these communities. So I'm just mentioning a few areas where government-private sector collaboration could really help.
No, it's great, and it is in your nature to be optimistic, and it's probably in my nature as a journalist to push you a little bit more on this one. Would it help if housing was made